Welcome to the second channel, the place where I post all the stuff that doesn't require painstaking hours of saying the same line over and over to get the phrasing just right. This video is going to be about all of the supplementary notes to the video I made a few weeks ago on the complex problems with writing mental illness in fiction. I originally had another idea on how to do it, about the history of mental illness representation and how that's changed and how that affected people. But it evolved as I was writing it. But the result was I essentially had an entire second essay written out full of stuff discussing the Enlightenment and Romanticism and early pharmacology and Shakespeare. And I did touch on some of these things very briefly in the final video, but I didn't go into it in the depth that it deserves or I had available to me. And that was because I really wanted to keep the argument focused on what I was discussing there, which I felt was a very important key idea. And this was just sort of like surrounding context. Interesting, but not vital. But before we get started, remember the charity stream for 24 hours on December 6th. It'll be for Crisis Text Line. All proceeds go to them. It'll be great to have you here on YouTube, well, on my main channel. Put it in your calendar. Have you done it yet? Go do it now, and then come back to the video. Okay, let's go. But we're just going to go through some of the really cool notes that I got, and we're going to do it while I'm wearing my favorite t-shirt. See, it's got Katara on it. I really love this shirt. I have like a few Avatar shirts, but this is my favorite, and I'm wearing Sting. There we go. So mental illness has always had some kind of representation historically. Shakespeare's Hamlet, you know, his to be or not to be speech is a surprisingly good exploration of suicidal ideation. And then there were characters like Agamemnon who would show signs of like neurosis, but none of these characters were really, you know, they weren't in like mental illness stories like we know them today. It didn't really gain a foothold. Mental illness didn't really gain a foothold until the Romantic era. And that kind of came out as a response to the Enlightenment. Now, stay with me. The Enlightenment was this kind of broad movement across Europe to emphasize things like liberalism, humanism, science, reason, and it sort of challenged the ideas of doctrine and faith. And those are great ways to think, but we saw in fiction that, you know, characters who emphasized reason and logic, they became the protagonists, and more emotive and faith-filled people were less intelligent, lesser, you know. And the Romantic era was something of a response to this kind of thing. Romantic writers and artists and musicians saw the Enlightenment as losing the value of seeing the world through emotion, subjective imagination, otherworldly experience, and faith. And it's because of this that Romantic writers needed a plot device to explore the world in a way that science couldn't. And this is a quote from Stella Swain. "Madness in the 19th century is predominantly an intellectually marginalized land of fiction which deals with the treacherous otherness of mad experience, which is often aligned with the supernatural." So we're seeing an emergence of a connection between kind of madness or mental illness and the supernatural or the other world, you know, the divine, that sort of thing. And there's actually a really nice poem from Wordsworth which kind of hints at this idea. Came out in the Romantic era. "Some call it madness, such indeed it was, if prophecy be madness, if things viewed by poets of old time may in these tutored days no more be seen with disordered sight." That's 1799 Wordsworth, called The Prelude. And there were kind of two ways that mental illness was broadly seen in this era. The first is the ability to see beyond human perception. Shakespeare represents psychic extremity in Hamlet and King Lear as raising the main protagonist's level of awareness beyond that of other characters in the drama. Exceptional or visionary states of consciousness are central to Romantic ideology. So we see that in Shakespeare, and Shakespeare at this point, by the way, was having a resurgence. It's not that Shakespeare was written during the Romantic era, but that Shakespeare was used by Romantic artists and writers. They sort of thought, hey, these are great. Look at these. They really emphasized them as stories. Fundamentally, it was supernatural. Mental illness kind of had this supernatural quality to it, because it was, quote, unleashing the most potent and enigmatic capacities of the imagination. And Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a really good example of this. Victor, the mad scientist, is described numerously as suffering from some kind of psychosis with hallucinations and possibly depression, but this mental condition is actually linked to his genius, and an exceptional state of mind that leads him to create life with the creature. And the second way that mental illness was commonly seen was through the sentimentalist novel in the late Romantic era. Sentimentalist novels typically use mental illness and eventual death as a way to punish those characters who committed sexual sin, and that's a quote from Katie E. Walk. It takes on a role markedly similar to a venereal disease, which is just a horrible take. It was not uncommon as a viewpoint that many people brought it upon themselves through a lack of moderation in various avenues of their lives in the 18th and 19th centuries. See, the role of mental illness eventually took a pretty dark turn in the Gothic novel, which, if you're not familiar with, is a particular kind of romantic novel with kind of Gothic castles and architecture and a big emphasis on place and landscape and the supernatural and ghosts. It's that suicidality and depression and your mind breaking was seen as a punishment for sin, especially sexual sin. As such, the Gothic novel instead very easily shifted mad people into the other category, which it so often exploits to create sinister, threatening scenes. Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre is the quintessential example of this. The character of Bertha Mason is incredibly violent. She's kind of the antagonistic force of the film, sort of, and she exhibits signs of neurosis and suicidal ideation and schizophrenia. But she ends up this way because she's depicted as a manipulative seductress who supposedly ployed the husband in the story into being with her husband being the victim of such immorality. Bronte connects her madness to the supernatural, describing her as an animalistic, demonic force, with her madness akin to a vampiric curse. Not great representation. Like, 2 out of 10? What, 1 out of 10? The Gothic novel didn't just passively alienate the mentally ill, but it actively encouraged their ostracization and otherness from society, that they are not one of us, they belong over there with the rabid demon people, and encouraging their exclusion from society. A fictional sentiment that really coincides with mental asylums that do exactly just that. Yeah, not even kidding. The whole kind of like, put them in prison. What do you mean? Prison? No, it's not prison. They're there to help them. But you can pay money to throw apples at them. Yes, that's a thing that happened. Like, you could go through mental asylums and pay money to like throw food at the mentally ill. Jeez. Humanity's awful. But, this all said, going through the Enlightenment, Romantic era, the late Romantic era with the Gothic novel, things do begin to change. With the growth of psychology as a scientific field, and psychoanalysis and behavioral analysis becoming a thing, a new way to see mental illness. And suddenly, madness, or mental illness, was no longer inexplicable. It wasn't an experience of the otherworldly forces, but, well, it was something that could be explained scientifically and reasoned through and treated. There's a really interesting quote from Stella Swain about this as well. Once madness is made to render up its threatening enigmatic status to the clinical gaze, it also gives up its position as other, as linked to the supernatural, as always beyond and external to the rational self. It is no longer unnatural or even irrational. In particular, a new era of fiction was kicked off in round about 1918. Just a totally inconspicuous year. Any idea why? Yeah, so World War I came to an end, and suddenly thousands, millions of guys were coming home with PTSD from the war. They were traumatized from this horrific experience, and suddenly a huge proportion of the population were returning to society very mentally ill. They called it shell shock at the time. And this need for a more categorical and clinical approach to PTSD and other mental illnesses led to the creation of the first DSM. This is the Diagnostic Manual. I can't quite remember what the full title is off the top of my head, but it's basically a very important book that catalogues all of the mental illnesses and ways to treat them and stuff. Suddenly, men weren't depressed, violent, seeing and hearing things because of a supernatural curse, but because of trauma and things in their past, like war. This new perception of mental illness did spark a new era of fiction, and it transformed the role that mental illness and mentally ill people played in fiction. In F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender is the Night, the character Dick descends into obsession, alcoholism, and it takes on an antagonistic role in the story as kind of a corrupting force in his life after his father's death, his public humiliation, and eventual loss of his job position. Mental illness, like depression, but in particular violence, began to be explained in fiction by trauma, or the character's past. Over time, it became a justification for villainy, a logical consequence. But, to be clear, it was still seen as a character flaw, a deficiency in who you are, and in the wider society, the belief that mental illness was a punishment for being bad, or at least that it was associated with being immoral, persisted, even if clinical circles began to change their approach. These kind of people just kind of acknowledged that there were logical or rational reasons for being that way, but the change was still slow. So, throughout the early 1900s, we get loads of villains and antagonists, and even some protagonists whose justification for evil acts were madness, schizophrenia, or mania. Those were really common ones in particular. And we started to develop what Heiler called 5 archetypes when it came to characters with mental illness. You'll probably recognize some of these. The homicidal maniac, think Psycho, the narcissistic parasite, the female seductress patient, which you can see sort of in characters like Bertha Mason, the rebellious free spirit, and the especially gifted. And, well, I got a bit to that in the video itself. But that one is probably the most common today. You probably noticed the especially gifted mentally ill person. That one's a really common one these days. 3 out of the 5 are actively negative. They're bad things, and they're always portrayed as bad things. And the 5th is pretty neutral. So, mental illness representation didn't really see progress, if we define progress as like good representation, in the 19s so much as we saw an evolution of how it was negatively portrayed, from a supernatural curse to a justification for evil. Our understanding increased, but our empathy didn't increase that much. It did, a little bit, but I think it'd be an overstatement to say that the 1900s were an era of empathy. No, things only really began to change in terms of mental illness representation when it came to the postmodern era, which began sometime in the 1950s and continued through to around the 1990s. We discussed the role of postmodernism briefly in the video, but I'd like to go into a little bit more detail here. And for whatever you might have heard about postmodernism, there's a really good quote from Daniel Pukowski and Professor Peter Antalius that I think summarizes the movement for the purposes of the discussion in this video. There is an emphasis on multiple realities and distrust of totalizing discourses, fragmentation, irony, pastiche, and collage. Essentially, postmodern works began to question the dominant ways of thinking about the world, and this included the idea that mentally ill people were dangerous, violent, or otherwise. Stories like Catcher in the Rye and The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath do this. Slaughterhouse 5 has a character suffering from PTSD, and Infinite Jest has addicts as protagonists. And a really common way to do this would be to take people from a marginalized group and place them at the center of the narrative, in hopes to get the reader to empathize with them and empathize with their struggles in the real world, to question the way we think about this marginalized group in particular. So we see stories like Catcher in the Rye or The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, which do exactly this. Slaughterhouse 5 has characters suffering from PTSD, and Infinite Jest has addicts as protagonists, addicts also being a marginalized group. My personal favourite is Blade Runner. People who know me will know that I love Blade Runner. It's just a fantastic story, but they use replicants. They are the oppressed outsiders of the story, seen as violent and lesser, and the writer places them at the heart of the story to reveal them at the end as victims. Their leader, Roy Batty, is actually positioned as the antagonist of the story, but by the end of the film, Ridley Scott leads us to see Roy Batty as just a human, or even more human than any of the other characters in the story. The marginalized other is placed at the center of the narrative, and we see the world from their point of view and empathize with them. Early postmodern works actually dealt more with things like sex and drugs, because those were the taboo topics that were really popular in the day as we emerged through the 1950s, 60s, 70s. But towards the 80s and 90s, new things began to be included, including mental illness. That sort of came to the forefront as well. And we didn't just have characters who were having sex outside marriage and doing drugs or were addicted to drugs, but characters who were suffering from suicidal ideation, depression, and schizophrenia, and they weren't seen as character flaws. And this was kind of the revolutionary idea. They were seen as character struggles, things to be overcome, things that they weren't responsible for necessarily, but things that they struggled against nevertheless. And this was a major difference in how they approached it in fiction. Even in the early 1900s, there was still this distinct idea that even though it's a struggle that they have, they are ultimately responsible for it, that they sort of got it because of the way they acted, they were too weak or something like that. There are still logical causes, but it's because they were too weak, it's their problem. No, that's no longer the case, and these later postmodern works, really exposed, I think, a new way of approaching it, and that was really good. And we see how that's bled into fiction these days. We see how it's had a really positive impact, and now we have a lot of characters who are really real, grounded, relatable, and their struggles are meaningful and not dismissive, and I love that. And that's how the stigma began to be undermined, and there's still a stigma today, but it's a lot less than it used to be, which is great. But yeah, those are honestly most of the notes that I've got. I've got some other quotes here and there about, mental illness and stuff like that, but that's kind of the broad context in which this whole video can take place and fit. I hope you found this interesting. It was still fun to put together, and I'm really happy that I get to share it with you. Do share the video with someone else if you think they'd find it interesting. I plan to do more videos on this channel, working on it. Leave me any questions you've got down below if you're curious. And let me know how you approach it in your story. But yeah, stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.